We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the world is not morally intelligible to us because of God's choice to make it that way. If the world were just obviously morally intelligible, we wouldn't be having this conversation. A lot of people wouldn't be atheists. So from the theist perspective, we're imagining a problem that doesn't exist, and many have lost their faith as a result, which, according to many Christians, gets you sent to hell for an eternity. Think about the fact that God made the natural world coherent to us. The laws of nature are discoverable and intelligible. He made things this way. So why has he made the world morally unintelligible? When the skeptical theist says there could be unknown morally sufficient reasons, they're admitting that the world seems morally unintelligible, first of all. They wouldn't have brought up skeptical theism otherwise. But they're implying, absurdly, that God has decided to make the world morally unintelligible to us. Why? Why on earth would he intentionally cause us to hallucinate a problem, especially one that would lead human beings away from a relationship with him? Doesn't he want a relationship with us? So people are being sent to hell for an eternity because God decided to create the illusion that the world was morally incoherent. If the world really is morally intelligible in reality, that means God is the author of confusion here. Why not make it so we can just tell that it's morally intelligible? We wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Atheists would lose one of their better arguments. Many of us wouldn't have lost our faith if the world were morally coherent. To quote Thomas Nagel, "The theistic responses to the argument from evil, of which I am aware, seem unpersuasive, and I find it hard to understand how belief in an all-good and all-powerful deity can survive in the face of it. Even if a theist supposes that the problem has a solution that we humans are unable to grasp, that would mean that God, who created us with the capacity to discover the laws of nature and to find the world scientifically intelligible, has made us incapable of finding the world morally intelligible. These are powerful reasons to doubt, and they have certainly destroyed the faith of some believers." End quote. Sometimes you'll hear believers say something to the effect of, "We are to God as an ant is to a human. We can't possibly understand his reasons." Well, whose fault is that? God chose to make us this way. Skeptical theism essentially asserts that humans suffer from a massive cognitive bias. We see gratuitous suffering where there is none. In fact, this alleged cognitive bias is arguably the most pervasive cognitive bias in the human catalog. Sometimes we mistake correlation for causation, sometimes we experience pareidolia and see faces in random patterns, and we often judge suffering to be unnecessary. How silly of us. Are we in any position to trust our cognitive faculties as reliable at all? After all, God must have had good reasons for implanting this powerful cognitive bias into our minds. How can we be sure that he hasn't created our faculties to be inaccurate, deceptive, and misleading in other ways? The skeptical theist already supposes that God has made our cognitive faculties deceptive and inaccurate in this way, so we should lose trust in our cognitive faculties in general, shouldn't we? After all, God might have a good reason for allowing us to be deceived. Actually, a Christian could reject skeptical theism on these grounds. God wouldn't create our faculties to be deceptive. But skeptical theism is predicated on the idea that God has created our minds with a massive cognitive bias, and one that's far more bewildering and dangerous than ordinary cognitive biases at that. If the theist supposes that God would provide us with reliable moral faculties, they can reject skeptical theism. To quote Aaron Lucas again, "Taken to its logical conclusion, skeptical theism prevents us from saying that God wouldn't have good reasons for allowing our cognitive faculties to be wildly inaccurate and deceptive. For all we know, God has very good reasons for instilling us with false memories, or making us brains in vats. Skeptical theism thereby gives us reasons to be skeptical of memory, perception, a priori reasoning, and so on." End quote. Skeptical theism is in conflict with the claim that, on theism, the probability that we can trust our cognitive faculties is high. The cost of skeptical theism here is that theists can no longer confidently make that claim. As is probably clear by now, skeptical theism causes problems that are worse than the one it aims to solve. It opens the floodgates for radical skepticism, including moral skepticism, and moral paralysis. Let's say you were a witness to an attempted sexual assault. You believe that you could prevent the assault if you wanted to, but you're a skeptical theist. If you had found out about the rape 5 minutes later, after the fact, then you would have concluded that the event was not an instance of pointless suffering, but you're a witness to it now, and you could prevent it. Everything you know suggests that you should help, but you just can't discount the possibility that the best thing to do would be to allow the rape to occur. Let me quote William Lane Craig on skeptical theism. The brutal murder of an innocent man or a child's dying of leukemia could produce a sort of ripple effect through history, such that God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting it might not emerge until centuries later, and perhaps in another land. When you think of God's providence over the whole of history, I think you can see how hopeless it is for limited observers to speculate on the probability that God could have a morally sufficient reason for permitting a certain evil. We're just not in a good position to assess such probabilities. End quote. So here are the two conflicting thoughts for you as a skeptical theist. I ought to prevent this rape because I judge that it's how goodness is best served, and I cannot judge how goodness is best served. I mean, do you want to prevent greater goods from emerging in another land? If you give up your ability to judge whether certain events are cases of pointless suffering, then how can you make moral judgments and therefore take moral actions? There's an intimate connection between moral judgment and moral action. If you give up your powers of assessing whether suffering is unnecessary, then how can you act? Think about the example of the daughter undergoing painful but necessary medical treatment. That's essentially the situation theists claim that we're in. Preventing apparently gratuitous suffering could be as foolish as preventing your daughter from getting the polio vaccine because it would be painful. You'd rather her take the shot to prevent the possibility of polio in the future. But if that's the case with the evils of our world, you'd be profoundly foolish to try to do anything about them, or at least many of them. Trying to prevent that rape, or trying to stop the toddler from crawling into traffic, could be as foolish as trying to stop your daughter from getting the polio vaccine because you don't want her to be pricked with a needle. But if they say, I think this suffering would be terrible and unnecessary, so I'm going to prevent it, then they're tipping their hand. They, along with me, believe that the world is as it seems. There is gratuitous evil in the world. It's not all necessary pain, like receiving a vaccine against polio. And that's why we should do something about the suffering in our world, if we can.